Welcome to our quiet corner of history. Tonight, we explore the Siege of Alexandria, not as a single event, but as a tapestry of human lives. First, find your favorite spot. Let your shoulders relax and pull that blanket up just a little higher. There is nothing else you need to do right now but settle in and breathe deeply. Where are you listening from tonight? Is it late in your part of the world, or are you just stealing a quiet moment before your day truly begins? Whatever the case, I am glad you have managed to escape your own perfectly scheduled chaos for a little while. If you enjoy these journeys into the past, a simple follow ensures you never miss our next story. Now, allow your mind to travel. We find ourselves in a magnificent city of marble and mines, a jewel on the sea. The year is 48 BCE. Within its great walls, a wealthy merchant worries over his silent docks, while a young guard squints from his post, seeing unfamiliar ships on the horizon. In the great library, a scholar carefully rolls a scroll, unaware of the approaching turmoil. Their world is about to change forever. From the shaded portico of his villa, Demetrius the merchant watched the sea. It was a habit born of a lifetime spent tracking the arrival and departure of fortunes upon the water. His ships, heavy with Egyptian wheat, were his children, and the harbor their home. Below, the city of Alexandria hummed with its usual energy, a tapestry of countless voices speaking Greek, Egyptian, and the harsh Latin of the traders from Italy. He drew a cool breath, noting the familiar smells of salt and baking bread from the districts below. It was then that he saw it, not on the shimmering water, but far inland, beyond the placid waters of Lake Mariotis. It was a faint, unnatural cloud against the crisp line of the horizon, a slow-rising stain of brown dust where no dust cloud should be. He felt no fear, only a swift, cold clarity. Other wealthy men might see a threat to their way of life. Demetrios saw a shift in the balance of things, and any shift could be turned to an advantage. His mind, as organized as his shipping ledgers, began its work. He mentally walked through his granaries, vast brick buildings near the western harbor, picturing the mountains of golden grain stored within. He counted the ships currently at his docks, their sails furled, and those due to arrive within the week. The dust on the horizon was a signal, an announcement that the value of every single thing he owned was about to change. He turned from the railing and called for his chief clerk, his voice calm and even. There were instructions to give, arrangements to be made, and quiet orders to dispatch before the rest of the city even knew to be afraid. While Demetrios calculated his future wealth, Aelia was deep in the heart of the city's present, navigating the crowded lanes of the Rakotis market. Here, the world felt loud and wonderfully alive. She moved between stalls, shaded by worn linen awnings, her senses drinking in the scene. A vendor selling fish from the Nile called out his prices, his voice competing with the sharp, sweet smell of dates piled high on a neighboring table. The air carried the scent of cumin and coriander from a spice merchant's stall, a fragrance that always reminded her of her mother's kitchen. She haggled good-naturedly for a small flask of olive oil, her fingers testing the weight of a loaf of bread, still warm from a clay oven. This was the rhythm of her life, the small, reassuring transactions that held her family together. The change came not as a shout, but as a murmur. It started near the canopic gate, a ripple of unease that spread from person to person faster than a dropped basket of figs. Aelia caught fragments of words: legions, the desert road, an army. People began to move differently, their steps quickening, their haggling becoming more urgent and less friendly. She saw a woman she knew from her street grab 3 extra bags of flour, her face tight with worry. Aelia felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The vendor who had just sold her the oil was already wiping the price from his slate, preparing to write a new, higher one. Without a second thought, she pushed back through the crowd, her mission no longer about tonight's dinner, but about the unknown needs of the coming weeks. She bought another flask of oil and 2 more bags of flour, the coins feeling lighter in her hand than they had just moments before. Above the growing anxiety of the market, on the massive stone walls that encircled Alexandria, Lycos felt the familiar weight of his bronze-capped shield on his arm. He and the other men of his unit had been called from their barracks with a sudden urgency that left no room for questions. Now they labored under the warm sky, their muscles straining as they helped move a great stone-throwing machine, an onager, into a better position along the ramparts. The rough-hewn limestone scraped his palms, and the sharp commands of his decurion cut through the grunts of exertion. Around him was the familiar company of soldiers, young men like himself, full of nervous energy, and older veterans whose faces showed no emotion at all. They had trained for this, yet the reality of it felt different, heavier. Lycos paused for a moment to wipe the sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm, his gaze sweeping over the city sprawling within its defenses. From this height, he could see the perfect grid of the streets, the gleaming marble of the grand temples, and even the distant, towering form of the Pharos lighthouse, the city's great stone guardian. He loved this city, its noise, its beauty, its unapologetic grandeur. The thought of an enemy breaching these walls, of foreign soldiers walking these streets, filled him with a cold, protective anger. He gripped the thick rope of the catapult, his knuckles white, and pulled alongside his comrades. The groan of the heavy wooden wheels on the stone walkway was a promise. They were the wall, and they would not break. Back in his villa, Demetrios had finished giving his orders. His clerk, a thin, nervous man named Philon, hurried away with a stack of wax tablets, his face pale. The instructions were simple. Divert the 2 ships arriving from Cyprus to a smaller, private harbor he owned down the coast. Delay the loading of 3 grain barges destined for Rome, citing unforeseen complications with the dock workers. Most importantly, he was to quietly buy up any available stores of salted fish and oil from smaller merchants, using trusted agents who would not be traced back to his house. It was a gamble. If the dust cloud turned out to be nothing, a trading caravan perhaps, or a migrating herd, he would lose a small fortune. But if it was what he suspected, a Roman army coming to settle the queen's messy political affairs, then the man who controlled the city's food would control its future. He walked back to his portico, this time with a cup of chilled wine. He was not a man of politics or warfare. He did not care who sat on the throne in Alexandria or who held power in Rome, as long as the sea lanes remained open and the price of wheat remained high. He thought of his family, his wife and 2 young sons, asleep in the inner courtyard of the villa. His duty was to them, to ensure their prosperity no matter which flag flew over the governor's palace. The approaching army was not a disaster, it was a season of opportunity, like a sudden drought that drives up the price of grain. And Demetrios was a very, very good farmer. In the market, the mood had soured completely. The earlier vibrancy had been replaced by a tense, competitive quiet. Aelia clutched her purchases tightly, navigating her way through people who no longer made eye contact. Their focus narrowed to securing what they could. She passed a temple dedicated to Serapis, a god who was part Greek and part Egyptian, and she offered a silent, hurried prayer. She saw a group of Roman merchants, usually loud and confident, speaking in low, urgent tones before disappearing into a side street. The multicultural harmony of the city suddenly felt thin and fragile, a beautiful vase with a crack running through it. The countless languages that usually blended into a pleasant hum now seemed to separate, each group murmuring amongst themselves, their eyes filled with suspicion. Aelia finally reached the edge of the marketplace, her arms aching from the weight of her bags. She glanced back and saw arguments breaking out at stalls that were now nearly empty. The comforting scent of baking bread was gone, replaced by the sharp odor of anxious sweat. She quickened her pace, her thoughts turning to her children. She had to get home. She had to secure the door and take stock of what they had. The world had felt large and full of promise an hour ago. Now it had shrunk to the size of her small home, and the only thing that mattered was what lay inside its walls. The city's problems were vast and political, but her own were simple and terrifying: how to keep her family fed when the world outside was closing in. For Lycos and his unit, the day's work stretched into the late afternoon. The great catapult was finally in place, its long throwing arm pointing out toward the desert like a defiant finger. Other units were doing the same all along the city's perimeter, a slow, deliberate process of awakening the city's defenses. The nervous excitement of the morning had settled into a weary resolve. The men shared a water skin, the cool liquid a welcome relief that did little to wash the grit from their throats. An old veteran, a man named Cassian, who had fought in campaigns in Syria, spat on the ground. "Let them come," he muttered to no one in particular. "They will break themselves on these stones, just like all the others." Lycos listened to the older man's words, wanting to share his confidence. He looked at the walls, stretching for miles in either direction, taller and thicker than any he had ever seen. The engineering was a marvel, a testament to the city's power and wealth. Surely Cassian was right. No army could take this place by force. Yet, as he looked out at the horizon, the dust cloud seemed darker now, wider, a creeping shadow that was slowly, patiently making its way toward them. He felt the rough texture of the stone beneath his hand, a solid and reassuring presence. For now, it was all that stood between his home and the approaching storm. As evening began to settle, the sounds from within Alexandria started to change.
The usual cheerful noise of a great city winding down for the day was absent. There were fewer children playing in the streets, and the music that often drifted from taverns was muted. Demetrios stood on his portico and listened, noticing the subtle shift in the city's heartbeat. He had done all he could for the moment. His assets were secure, his plans in motion. Now, all he could do was watch and wait, a spider in the center of a web, feeling for the first vibrations of contact.
Aelia barred the door to her small home, the sound of the heavy wood sliding into place offering a small comfort. Her children were playing quietly in the corner, unaware of the fear that had gripped their mother. She carefully stored the extra flour and oil, her mind already rationing, planning, and worrying. The world had become a place of whispers, and her home was the only sanctuary. In the barracks near the wall, Lycos cleaned his spear, the rhythmic work of oil and cloth a familiar meditation. He thought of his family in the village he came from, wondering if they were safe. His duty was here, but his heart was with them. Around the great city, the familiar routines of daily life began to fray, strained by the weight of 1,000 private fears, all born from that single, distant smudge of dust. Outside the city, where the land stretched flat and pale towards the horizon, the Roman centurion Marcus directed the methodical work of his men. The fine desert sand, carried by a persistent breeze, found its way into everything: the folds of his tunic, the joints of his armor, and the leather of his sandals. He felt the familiar grit with every step. All around him, the sounds of disciplined labor filled the day. The rhythmic thud of mallets driving stakes for the palisade, the scrape of shovels against hard-packed earth, and the low orders of decurions echoing down the line. His thoughts were not on glory or conquest, but on the simple, brutal mathematics of a siege. Logistics were the true weapon of Rome, a force more relentless than any sword. His current task was vital. He led a small detachment to the series of wells that lay just beyond arrow range of Alexandria's walls. These were the channels that fed the city's outer cisterns, a lifeline for those living near the perimeter. "No more," he commanded, his voice rough from the dust. His men worked efficiently, not with poison from a vial, but with something far more practical. They hauled the carcasses of dead pack animals, already drawing flies in the heat, and shoved them into the well openings. Then they added salt, bags and bags of it, until the very earth around the wells seemed to cry out for water. This act felt less like a battle and more like a farmer salting a field to ensure nothing would grow. Because of this, he knew thirst would soon become a weapon wielded from within the city's own walls. While Marcus and his legionaries sealed the city's access to fresh water, Demetrios the merchant found himself summoned to a chamber deep within the royal quarter. The air in the room was still, and the fine wool of his robes felt suddenly restrictive, clinging to his skin. He sat on a carved wooden chair, its polished surface cool against his back, surrounded by the city's most powerful men. Their faces, usually composed and confident, were etched with deep lines of worry. A senior official, his voice strained, announced the inevitable. A city-wide rationing plan would begin at dawn. Every private grain store was to be declared, inventoried, and placed under civic control. This decree struck Demetrios with the force of a physical blow. His granaries, filled with the finest Egyptian wheat, were the foundation of his family's wealth, the result of years of careful planning and shrewd trades. He felt a bitter conflict rise within him, a struggle between his duty as a citizen of Alexandria and the powerful, primal instinct to protect his own. His mind, a natural abacus, began to calculate the immense losses. He listened to the officials speak of shared sacrifice and the common good, but all he could hear was the quiet, insistent whisper of self-preservation. To surrender his stores was to surrender his future. Yet to refuse was to be branded a traitor. The choice felt like a stone lodged in his throat. The scarcity announced in that grand chamber soon rippled through every part of the city, reaching even the quietest corners where knowledge was held more precious than gold. In the vast, silent halls of the great library, the scholar Theon noticed the first true sign of the siege, not in the anxious murmurs of the populace, but in the quality of the light. The lamps, which usually burned with a bright, steady flame, were now kept low, their wicks trimmed to conserve the dwindling supply of fresh olive oil. The change was subtle, but to a man who spent his life in the company of scrolls, it was as alarming as a crack in the foundation of the building itself. Without light, the work of copying, studying, and preserving would cease. This realization prompted a series of hushed, urgent discussions among the senior scholars. They gathered in a side chamber, the scent of old papyrus and cedar wood a familiar comfort against the rising tide of fear. The debate was not about if they should act, but how. Which collections were most vital? Theon argued for the medical texts of Hippocrates and Galen, knowledge that could save lives. Another scholar, a historian named Lycomedes, insisted that the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides must be prioritized, for what was a city without its memory? A third, a philosopher, made a passionate case for the dialogues of Plato, arguing that wisdom was the only thing that could sustain them through the coming darkness. Each argument held weight, and Theon felt the burden of their collective responsibility settle upon him. He looked at his hands, the fingers stained with the dark ink he used for his transcriptions. These hands could save a treatise on the movement of the stars, or a collection of irreplaceable poems. The choice felt impossible, a betrayal of one truth in favor of another. He and his colleagues decided to begin with the practical sciences and histories, moving the most valuable scrolls to the subterranean vaults, deep below the library, where they might be safe from fire and destruction. The process was slow and painstaking, each scroll handled with a reverence that bordered on prayer. As they worked, the sounds from the city outside seemed to fade away, replaced by the soft rustle of papyrus and the careful footfalls of scholars moving through the shadowed corridors. Theon carried an armful of scrolls containing detailed astronomical charts, their diagrams mapping the heavens with beautiful precision.
He wondered if the Romans, with their focus on roads and legions, could ever truly appreciate what was at stake here. This wasn't merely a building full of books. It was the accumulated thought of centuries, a fragile ecosystem of ideas that, once lost, could never be fully recovered. The thought made his movements even more deliberate.
Back in the Roman camp, Marcus inspected the newly dug trenches that now formed a complete circle around Alexandria. The earthworks were deep and wide, a raw, ugly scar upon the landscape. His legionaries, accustomed to such labor, had completed the task with impressive speed. Now their focus shifted to constructing siege engines, great wooden towers and powerful catapults that would eventually challenge the city's famous walls. He felt a grim satisfaction in the progress. The circle was closed. Nothing could get in, and nothing could get out. His part in the great machine of the Roman army was to turn this key, to lock the city away from the world and wait for hunger and thirst to do their work. Inside the locked city, Aelia stood in a growing line for the day's bread ration. She clutched a small cloth bag containing a few bronze coins, their familiar weight no longer a comfort. The scent of baking that usually drifted from the neighborhood ovens was faint, and when it did reach her, it smelled of coarse barley, not the fine wheat she was used to. The faces of the people around her were tight with anxiety. They spoke in low voices, sharing rumors about the Roman earthworks and whispers about poisoned wells. She tried to block it out, focusing instead on the image of her children's faces, a tactic that both sharpened her fear and gave her strength. The rationing official, a man she recognized from the local market, looked weary as he handed her a small, dense loaf of dark bread. It was barely enough for one person, let alone a family of 3. She accepted it without complaint, as did everyone else. Open dissent was a luxury no one could afford. As she walked home, she clutched the loaf to her chest as if it were a jewel. She passed the grand colonnades leading towards the library district and saw scholars hurrying in and out, their arms laden with scrolls. A flicker of resentment passed through her. She wondered if all that recorded wisdom could teach a person how to divide one small loaf of bread into 3 satisfying meals. That evening, Demetrios sat in the courtyard of his villa, the sound of the fountain a gentle murmur in the twilight. He had made his official declaration to the city magistrates, reporting only a fraction of his actual stores. The lie sat uneasily in his stomach, a sour counterpoint to the fine wine in his cup. He told himself it was for his family, a necessary deception to ensure their survival. Yet, as he watched the first stars appear in the sky, he could not escape the feeling that he had made a choice not just for his household, but for the entire city. His hidden grain could prolong the siege, or, if discovered, it could brand him an enemy of the people he sought to protect. Across the city, in the barracks near the walls, the soldier Lycos shared a ration of the same coarse barley bread with his comrades. They broke it apart with their hands and ate it slowly, savoring each dense bite.
They had spent the day reinforcing a section of the ramparts, their muscles aching from lifting heavy stones and timbers. Their talk was not of politics or philosophy, but of the practical realities of their situation, the strength of the new Roman fortifications, the range of their catapults, the sharpness of their own swords. The world for them had shrunk to the length of a spear and the height of a wall. And in the deepest vault of the great library, Theon carefully placed the last scroll of a historical collection onto a wooden shelf. The air was cool and dry, a perfect environment for preservation. He and his fellow scholars had worked without rest, their movements fueled by a shared sense of purpose. As he sealed the heavy stone door to the vault, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment mixed with a deep and unsettling sorrow. They had saved the words, the ideas, the histories, but they had entombed them. The light of knowledge had been hidden away, and he did not know when or if it would ever be brought out into the world again. The faint scent of aging papyrus lingered in the corridor, as Theon considered all that had been secured and all that was now lost to the living. The long weeks of the siege settled into a grinding routine, stripping away the initial shock and leaving behind a dull, persistent ache. Within the city, the methodical distribution of grain became the central rhythm of each day, a constant reminder of the tightening Roman circle. For the scholars in the great library, the rationing of lamp oil meant their work now followed the sun, their hurried copying ending as dusk fell and plunged the corridors into shadow. The careful preservation of knowledge had become a race against the dwindling light. Each copied scroll a small victory against the encroaching darkness. This new reality, defined by limits and conservation, reshaped life inside the walls, turning every measure of flour and every drop of oil into a symbol of the city's endurance. On the ramparts, this slow passage of time wore differently on the soldiers. For Lycos, the nights were the hardest. The moon cast long, distorted shadows across the stone walkway, turning familiar shapes into monstrous figures. He leaned against the cool crenellations, the rough stone a solid presence against his back, and stared out at the sea of Roman campfires that glittered like a malevolent constellation on the dark plain. The constant vigilance had etched new lines of fatigue around his eyes, and the bland, gritty taste of barley rations was a permanent feature in his mouth. He and his comrades no longer spoke of glorious charges or decisive battles. Their talk was of dwindling wineskins and rumors of supply ships that never seemed to arrive. It was during one such endless watch that the first real crack appeared in his simple loyalty. Hidden in the deep shadow of a watchtower, two older soldiers, veterans of a dozen forgotten campaigns, spoke in low, gravelly voices. Lycos, meant to be watching the Roman lines, found his attention snared by their hushed conversation. "For what are we truly fighting?" one of them muttered, his voice raspy with discontent. "For Alexandria, or for the Queen's Roman lover?
She plays her games with these powerful men, and we are the pieces she sacrifices on the board." The other man grunted in agreement. "She is not one of us. Her family came from Macedon centuries ago. What does she know of this city's soul? We bleed on these walls for her ambitions, not for our homes." Lycos felt a cold unease creep into his heart, a feeling far more unsettling than the fear of battle. He had always seen his duty as a straight, clear line: defend the city, obey his commanders, honor the queen. The words of the veterans, however, twisted that line into a confusing knot. He had never thought to question who he was fighting for. Was it for the bustling markets and fragrant spice docks of his home, or for a ruler whose allegiances seemed to shift with the political winds blowing from Rome? The thought was a traitorous one, and he tried to push it away, focusing on the distant flicker of enemy fires. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it began to sprout in the quiet, watchful darkness. On the other side of that same wall, in a command tent filled with the scent of oiled leather and papyrus, the Roman centurion Marcus faced a different kind of resistance. Before him stood a captured Alexandrian fisherman, a man whose skin was as tough and sun-cured as the nets he cast. His hands, though bound, were calloused and strong, and his eyes held a defiant glare that no amount of Roman authority could extinguish. Marcus, a man who valued order and practicality above all else, found the fisherman's stubbornness deeply frustrating. He had offered the man food, water, and the promise of safety for his family, a generous offer, in his view, for simple information about the harbor's hidden channels. The fisherman, however, merely spat on the dirt floor of the tent. "My family eats pride, Roman, not your stale bread," he rasped in coarse Greek. "You think you can buy this city? You cannot buy the sea. You cannot buy the wind, and you cannot buy the spirit of a people who have read more books than your entire nation has ever seen." The man's words were a direct challenge, not of military strength, but of cultural worth. Marcus felt a flicker of annoyance. He was a soldier, not a philosopher, and he had little patience for such speeches. He saw only a strategic problem, while the fisherman saw a clash of entire worlds. Marcus tried a different approach, switching from incentives to threats. He spoke of the siege engines being constructed, the catapults that could splinter a fishing boat from 1,000 paces, the slow starvation that would inevitably break the city. He described the fate of other cities that had defied Rome, painting a grim picture of destruction and servitude. He watched the fisherman's face closely for any sign of fear, any crack in his resolve. He wanted the man to understand the cold, hard logic of the situation. Resistance was futile. A swift surrender would save lives, while this proud defiance would only lead to ruin. Yet the fisherman seemed unmoved by the threats. Instead, a small, bitter smile touched his lips. "You Romans understand force," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You understand walls and swords and discipline. But you do not understand Alexandria. We are not just one people. We are Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, Nubians. We argue in the marketplace and debate in the library. Our strength is not in our walls, but in our minds. You can tear down our stones, but you cannot conquer an idea. This statement, delivered with such conviction, left Marcus momentarily speechless. The gap between his world of legionary standards and unwavering obedience, and this man's world of fierce intellectual independence, felt as wide and deep as the great sea itself. Frustrated, Marcus dismissed the fisherman, sending him back to the prisoner stockade. As the man was led away, Marcus poured himself a cup of watered wine, its sour taste doing little to soothe his irritation. He had faced warriors from Gaul and skirmishers from Britannia, men who fought with wild fury or disciplined resolve. He understood them. But this city was different. Its defiance was rooted in something he couldn't simply break with a battering ram. It was an arrogance born from centuries of being the center of the learned world, a belief in their own cultural superiority that Marcus found both baffling and, in a strange way, admirable. This sense of a deeper, unseen conflict extended throughout the Roman camp. The legionaries, mostly practical men from Italian farms and provincial towns, found the Alexandrians' resistance perplexing. They had expected a swift campaign, another jewel for the Republic's crown. Instead, they were mired in a lengthy siege against a city that fought not just with spears and arrows, but with a stubborn pride they couldn't comprehend. The soldiers made jokes about it around their fires, mocking the Greeks for fighting with words instead of swords. Yet an undercurrent of grudging respect was beginning to form for the city that refused to bow. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, casting a silver light over the silent walls and the sprawling camp, the two worlds remained locked in their stalemate. Inside the city, Lycos wrestled with his newfound doubts, his loyalty now a fragile thing. He looked at the familiar faces of his fellow soldiers and wondered how many of them shared the secret, whispered questions he now harbored. The city he was defending suddenly felt more complex, its leaders more fallible, and his own role in its defense less certain than it had ever been before. In these quiet moments, standing his lonely watch, Lycos could almost forget the weight of the siege engines waiting in the darkness. He could almost ignore the gnawing hunger in his belly. What he could not ignore, however, were the whispers he had overheard, words that had become heavier and more dangerous than any Roman stone hurtling from a catapult. This section explored the ideological and cultural clashes of the siege, showing a soldier's loyalty wavering due to internal dissent, and a Roman officer's frustration with the fierce intellectual pride of an Alexandrian captive. End state, weeks into the siege, morale is beginning to fray on both sides, with internal doubts emerging among the Alexandrian defenders, and a growing grudging respect for their enemy's cultural resilience appearing among the Roman attackers. The doubt that had taken root within the city's defenders began to manifest in new ways. It was no longer confined to hushed conversations on the ramparts, but was now fueled by a new, more visceral fear. The first sign came not as a whisper, but as a distant roar from the direction of the great harbor. A sudden clash of bronze and wood echoed across the rooftops, followed by the splintering crack of a ship's mast. From the high walls, men could see a desperate naval skirmish unfolding, a chaotic dance of Roman galleys and Alexandrian vessels near the sea gate. The engagement was brief and brutal, ending as quickly as it had begun, but its consequences lingered. A Roman fire ship, its purpose fulfilled, had drifted into a cluster of wooden warehouses lining the docks. Flames began to lick at the dry timber, greedily climbing towards the sky. This new development sent a different kind of alarm through the city. A column of dark, greasy smoke began to rise, twisting and turning on the sea breeze until it formed a broad, dark stain against the otherwise clear sky. The plume drifted inland, its shadow falling across the tiled roofs of the Bruttian Quarter, the city's royal and intellectual heart. It crept inexorably towards the gleaming marble facade of the great library. Inside, Theon was meticulously comparing two different transcriptions of a geometric proof when the light from the high, unshuttered windows began to dim. He looked up, annoyed at the interruption, and saw the world outside had been painted a sickly, ominous shade of orange-gray. A moment later, the first scent of burning wood and pitch reached him, a smell that did not belong among the familiar, clean aroma of papyrus and aging cedar wood. Panic did not erupt at once. It seeped into the halls like the smoke itself. The chief librarian, a man whose composure was as legendary as his scholarship, strode through the main reading room, his voice calm but firm. He gave orders to close the heavy bronze doors and dispatch runners to the city guard for assistance. Yet the scholars themselves knew the true danger. A fire, once it took hold in a place filled with thousands upon thousands of flammable scrolls, would be an unstoppable beast. A frantic yet organized chaos took hold. Men whose hands were more accustomed to the delicate work of unrolling brittle texts now grabbed leather buckets and formed lines to the cisterns, their fine tunics quickly becoming soaked and smudged with soot. Theon's throat began to feel raw, and his eyes watered from the irritating haze that was now finding its way through every crack and vent. He and a small group were tasked with the most vital and heartbreaking of duties, saving what could be saved. They rushed to the section containing the most unique and irreplaceable works, the ones for which no copies existed anywhere else in the world. Their footsteps echoed in the suddenly cavernous-feeling halls, the normal scholarly silence replaced by the muffled shouts from outside and the hurried, anxious breathing of his colleagues. They worked with a desperate urgency, their movements swift but careful as they lifted the precious scrolls from their ordered niches. Each scroll was a weight of history, a lifetime of thought and discovery encased in a simple roll. Theon grabbed an armful of astronomical charts, their intricate diagrams of constellations suddenly feeling terribly fragile.
As he carried his load towards the stone-lined subterranean vaults, he passed a collection of lyric poetry from the Old Isles, the life's work of a woman whose words were said to capture the very essence of love and loss. One of the scroll cases had fallen to the floor, and he paused, his heart constricting. Beside it lay a heavy, practical-looking text, its title clearly marked, Wounds and Their Treatment. It was a famous medical manual, filled with detailed instructions on setting bones, stitching gashes, and preparing poultices for infections. Theon knew that men were dying on the walls every day. He also knew that the poetry in his hand was one of only 2 known copies in existence. For a single, agonizing moment, he was frozen by an impossible choice. His mind reeled with the question, what was the purpose of their great endeavor? Was it to preserve the beauty that made life worth living, or the practical knowledge that allowed life to continue at all? The distant clamor of the skirmish felt closer now, a brutal reminder of the world outside these sacred walls. His hands, stained with the dark ink of his trade, trembled as he gently placed the poetry scroll back on its shelf. He felt a pang of profound grief, as if he were abandoning a dear friend to the flames. With a heavy sigh that scraped his smoke-irritated lungs, he picked up the medical text. Its weight felt different, denser, a burden of grim necessity. As he turned and hurried towards the safety of the vaults, he did not look back. Far from the frantic efforts of the scholars, Alia stood on the flat roof of her tenement building, watching the same dark smudge spread across the sky. From her vantage point in the crowded Rakotis district, the great library was a distant, majestic shape of white stone, a symbol of a world she rarely entered. The harsh smell of the fire reached her even here, a scent of pure destruction that made the knot of hunger in her stomach tighten with a new kind of fear. She drew her 2 children close, their small faces turned upwards towards the unnatural cloud. She could hear the anxious murmur of her neighbors on other rooftops, their voices carrying easily in the still afternoon. The questions were all the same. Would the fire spread? Were the Romans attacking from the harbor? Was this the beginning of the end? She reached for the small charm she wore on a leather cord around her neck. It was a simple, crudely molded piece of clay, a figure that blended the shape of the Greek goddess Tyche, who governed fortune, with the familiar headdress of the Egyptian Isis. It was a comfort she could hold in her hand, a small, tangible piece of hope in a city that felt increasingly unreal. Her gaze shifted from the smoke back to the distant marble walls of the library. She knew it held the collected wisdom of generations, stories of kings and gods, secrets of the stars and the earth. Men spent their entire lives within those walls, reading and writing, debating ideas she could barely imagine. She wondered if a single one of those countless scrolls contained a way to make a small bag of barley last for another week. This thought, she knew, would have sounded foolish and ungrateful to the man of learning, but it was the most pressing question in her world. What was the value of 1,000 books of philosophy when her children's bellies were empty? Could a poem soothe a fever? Could a history of a long-dead king's wars provide a single drop of clean water? The plume of smoke seemed to mock the grand building beneath it, a dark finger pointing out the fragility of all the knowledge it contained. She held her charm tighter, its rough, familiar texture a stark contrast to the abstract treasures being threatened across the city. Her children's survival was her library, their future the only text she was desperate to preserve. For Theon, the world had shrunk to the narrow, stuffy corridors leading to the underground vaults. The air here was cooler, tasting of damp stone and earth, a welcome relief from the smoky haze above. He and the others worked in near silence, piling the rescued scrolls onto stone shelves. He placed the heavy medical text among a collection of architectural treatises and agricultural manuals. Looking at the assembled works, he saw a testament to human ingenuity, ways to build, to heal, to grow, to understand. But the scrolls they had left behind haunted him. The plays, the epics, the histories of faraway lands, the philosophical dialogues, all of that felt like the city's soul. He feared they were saving the bones of their civilization while letting its spirit burn. Outside, the sounds of the city guard arriving at the library, the tramping of sandals on stone, the shouted commands, provided a small measure of reassurance. The immediate danger to the collection might soon pass. Yet, as Theon leaned against the cool stone wall to catch his breath, his body aching from the unaccustomed labor, a deeper unease settled over him. The siege was forcing choices upon them all, not just between life and death, but between different kinds of survival. He had always believed that knowledge was the most powerful tool of all, the one thing that lifted humanity above mere existence. Now he was not so sure. The raw, brutal power of a Roman legion, the simple, desperate need for a loaf of bread, these things seemed to mock the elegant proofs and beautiful verses stored in his memory. From her roof, Aelia watched as the smoke began to thin. The distant shouts died down, and the angry orange glow near the harbor faded with the setting sun. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through her neighborhood. The great fire had been contained, the danger averted for now. But the image of that dark plume remained etched in her mind. It had been a stark visualization of their predicament, a city of immense wealth and learning slowly being choked, its treasures rendered meaningless by the simple, primitive realities of a blockade. She wondered if the men in the great stone buildings understood that. Did they know that for most of Alexandria, the true siege was not happening at the walls, but at the kitchen table?
The choices made and moments of crisis laid bare the city's true foundations. For Theon, it was the bitter realization that a practical manual for a surgeon held more immediate worth than a masterpiece of poetry. For Aelia, it was the quiet confirmation that all the accumulated knowledge of the ages was worth less than a full stomach and the healthy laughter of her children. The smoke had dissipated, but the questions it had raised lingered, weaving themselves into the fabric of their besieged world, as much a part of their reality now as the Roman trenches and the dwindling sacks of grain. The announcement came not with the blast of a horn, but in the quiet, clipped tones of Commander Ptolemos, a man whose ambition shone brighter than his polished bronze cuirass. Lycos stood in formation with the rest of his unit, the evening air cooling the sweat on his neck. The commander unrolled a papyrus scroll with a flourish, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed courtyard. They were to conduct a raid, a daring strike against the newest Roman siege tower that loomed like a wooden giant in the moonlight. Ptolemos spoke of glory, of striking a blow that would ring through the city. But the older soldiers beside Lycos simply stared at the ground. Their silence was more telling than any shouted objection. They knew a fool's errand when they heard one. Lycos felt the familiar weight of his shield on his arm, a solid, dependable presence in a moment suddenly filled with uncertainty. As the men were dismissed to prepare, the usual pre-battle clamor was absent. Instead, a grim quiet settled over them. Men checked the straps on their sandals and the sharpness of their short swords with slow, deliberate movements. An older soldier named Crito, a man whose face was a map of forgotten skirmishes, spat on the ground. "Glory," he muttered to Lycos, his voice low and bitter. "The only glory he's interested in is his own. He'll write a fine report about it while our wives collect our bones." Lycos watched another soldier carefully tie a small carved wooden bird to his belt, a charm to grant him the lightness of foot needed to return. Lycos had no such charm. He simply ran a thumb over the worn leather grip of his sword, his heart beating a fast, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He had to obey, for that was a soldier's purpose. But a cold knot of doubt tightened in his stomach. The plan felt thin, brittle, like a sheet of cheap papyrus.
They moved through the city's silent streets, their footsteps muffled by the dust. Reaching the designated section of the wall, they descended on thick ropes, one by one, into the darkness of the no-man's land between the fortifications and the Roman lines. The air here smelled of damp earth and stale fear. Every snapped twig, every dislodged pebble sounded as loud as a dropped shield in the tense quiet. Lycos kept his breathing shallow, trying to make himself smaller, to blend into the shadows that clung to the base of the great wall. He could see the Roman campfires in the distance, small points of orange in a sea of blackness. Above them, the target was a solid, menacing shape against the star-dusted sky, a testament to Roman engineering and persistence. It was a structure of immense beams and covered ramps, a multi-storied beast designed to vomit soldiers directly onto their ramparts. The approach to the siege tower was agonizingly slow. The ground was littered with the debris of earlier skirmishes, splintered arrows, discarded bits of armor, and the unsettling shape of things best left unidentified in the dark. As they drew closer, Lycos could make out the details of its construction. The thick hide coverings soaked to prevent fire, and the dark openings that were surely watched by Roman sentries. The plan was to set fires at its base, using pots of oil and pitch. It was a simple plan, perhaps too simple. Crito tapped Lycos's shoulder and pointed. A single helmet briefly caught the moonlight on the tower's second level. They had been seen. The whispered alarm had barely passed down their line when the first volley of arrows hissed out of the darkness. The raid dissolved instantly from a coordinated strike into a desperate scramble for survival. On the other side of the field, in the Roman camp, Centurion Marcus felt the familiar vibration through the soles of his collegae, the heavy sandals of a legionary, a moment before the alarm horn blew. He was already awake, having long learned that Alexandrians preferred to fight at night, thinking it gave them an advantage.
He grabbed his helmet and sword, his movements economical and practiced. Outside his tent, his cohort was already forming up. The disciplined clatter of shields and spears, a comforting sound of Roman order. He had positioned extra pickets near the new tower, anticipating exactly this kind of bold, foolish attack. He felt no excitement, only a weary sense of inevitability. These were men sent to die for a cause that was already lost, and it was his job to make their deaths as swift and efficient as possible.
Marcus directed his men with hand signals, flanking the disorganized attackers in a classic pincer movement. There was no need for grand speeches. Each man knew his role. The fighting was brief and brutal, illuminated by the fire pots the raiders had dropped, which now cast flickering, distorted shadows across the ground. Marcus watched as his legionaries, with their large, curved shields interlocked, advanced like an unstoppable tortoise, their short, stabbing swords doing their deadly work. He noted the Alexandrians' courage, a desperate and wild energy, but it was no match for disciplined lines and superior training. Within minutes, the shouting subsided, replaced by the groans of the wounded. He saw a few of the attackers scrambling back toward the dark safety of their city walls, and he let them go. The message had been sent. The final tally was a dozen Alexandrians dead, and twice that number captured. His own losses were minimal, 2 men killed and a handful with minor wounds. It was, by any military standard, a decisive victory. Yet, as Marcus walked through the aftermath, the scent of spilled oil and blood sharp in the night, he felt a deep sense of waste. These were needless deaths on both sides, a small expenditure of lives for no strategic gain. The siege tower was untouched, and the city remained defiant. This raid changed nothing, except for the families who would now be in mourning. He ordered the wounded to be tended to, both his own and the enemy's, before making his way to the command tent. He knew this victory would be seen very differently by his superior. The tribune, Lucius Cassius Gallus, was a young man from a powerful family, and his tent reflected his status. It was spacious, with a portable mosaic floor and a table laden with wine jugs and maps held down by polished stones. Gallus was beaming, his face flushed with wine and excitement. "A fine night's work, Marcus," he exclaimed, clapping the centurion on the shoulder. "We showed them the price of testing Rome. I shall mention your cohort's swift action in my report to the legate." Marcus inclined his head stiffly, his senses taking in the comfortable scene, so far removed from the grim reality of the fighting ground he had just left. The contrast between the tribune's easy celebration and the lives just extinguished created a bitter taste in his mouth. He ordered the wounded to be tended to, both his own and the enemy's, before making his way to the command tent. He knew this victory would be seen very differently by his superior.
The attack was repelled as expected, Tribune, Marcus said, his voice flat and formal. But they will try again. And a direct assault on the walls, which I hear you are now considering, will cost us hundreds of men, perhaps thousands. The slow work, the trenching, the blockade, starving them out, is what will ultimately win this city for us. It is the patient way. It is the Roman way. He knew he was overstepping his bounds, but the sight of his 2 dead legionaries, young men from farms in Gaul, compelled him to speak. He believed that a commander's first duty was to preserve the lives of his men, not to spend them carelessly for a chance at personal glory. Gallus's smile vanished, replaced by a cold condescension. Patience, centurion, is a virtue for farmers, not for soldiers on the verge of a great victory. Do you think Caesar took Gaul with patience? He took it with boldness, with decisive action. A swift, bloody assault will break their spirit completely. A long siege will only allow disease and dissent to fester in our own camp. I am not here to dig ditches. I am here to conquer a city for the glory of Rome and my own name. You will prepare your men for an attack on the gate of the sun at first light. Marcus felt a surge of frustration so powerful it made his hands clench into fists. He was arguing with a man who saw soldiers not as men, but as figures on a map, pieces to be sacrificed in a game of ambition. Lycos was one of the last to make it back over the wall, his arm bleeding from a deep gash and his body aching with exhaustion. Crito had not been so fortunate. As Lycos stumbled through the gate, he saw Commander Ptolemos standing there, already speaking with an aide, his face animated not with concern for the survivors, but with the thrill of his own narrative. "A vicious fight," Lycos heard him say. "We inflicted heavy casualties before making a strategic withdrawal." The words were like poison. There had been no strategy, only a slaughter. Lycos limped past without a word, the commander not even glancing in his direction. The lie was already being crafted, a glorious story to cover the truth of their failure. Back in the barracks, the silence was a heavy shroud. Of the 20 men who had gone out, only 7 had returned. The empty spaces on the stone floor where his friends had laid their bedrolls just hours before seemed to accuse him. He sat down heavily, the pain in his arm a dull throb that anchored him to the miserable present. He thought of Crito's cynical words and realized the old soldier had been right. They were nothing more than stones for the commanders to throw, and their price was cheap. All the loyalty he had ever felt toward his city and its leaders seemed to crumble away, leaving behind only the cold, hard reality of survival. Marcus returned to his own much simpler tent, the tribune's arrogant command echoing in his mind. He would obey, of course. He was a Roman officer, and obedience was the spine of the legions. But he would do so with a heavy heart, knowing that good men would die because of a young nobleman's hunger for fame. He ran a hand over his weary face, the grit of the desert a constant presence on his skin. He knew this siege would not be won by a single glorious charge. It would be won by attrition, by the slow, grinding pressure that wore down walls, supplies, and eventually the will to fight. It was a truth as old as warfare itself, but it was a lesson the tribune Gallus had yet to learn. He stepped outside his tent and looked toward the silent, dark walls of Alexandria. The city held its breath,
waiting for the dawn and the violence it would bring. A part of him admired its stubbornness, its refusal to bow. But his professional mind saw only the grim calculus of the coming assault. He knew that by this time tomorrow, the ground before the gate of the sun would be soaked in blood, both Roman and Alexandrian. As Marcus finally turned back to his campaign cot, the distant, mournful howl of a lone jackal was a familiar and unsettling sound in the vast quiet of the night. The grain had become the new gold, and Demetrius's granaries were the city's most formidable treasury. The rationing edicts issued by the city's leaders felt like a distant memory, a piece of political theater from the early days of the siege when order still seemed possible. Now, true power was not held by the men who wore the insignia of command, but by the one who controlled the last great reserves of food. Demetrius felt this shift in the way people looked at him in the few times he ventured into the public squares. Their gazes were a mixture of hope and resentment, a heavy burden that he carried back to the quiet courtyard of his villa. He spent his days in his ledgers, but the columns of numbers no longer represented simple profit. They were calculations of survival, tallies of days and lives. This newfound gravity was confirmed when a servant announced the arrival of Agathos, a senior magistrate and a leading voice in the Queen's war council. The man was brought not to the public reception rooms, but to a small private study overlooking a dusty garden where the fountains had long run dry. Agathos, once a man of considerable size and booming confidence, seemed diminished. His robes hung loosely on his frame, and his eyes, set deep in their sockets, held a desperate fire. He wasted no time on pleasantries, his voice a dry rasp. He spoke of duty, of loyalty to the Queen, and of the unyielding spirit of Alexandria. He painted a future where Demetrius would be celebrated as a hero, his name etched alongside the city's founders, if he would only release his grain to the military commissaries to sustain the soldiers and, by extension, the war. He promised land, titles, and a stake in the city's trade that would make Demetrius's current fortune seem like a handful of loose coins. After the magistrate had departed, the offer lingered in the still room. It was a tempting proposition, appealing directly to the merchant's ambition that had guided Demetrios his entire life. He could secure his family's future for generations, becoming not just wealthy, but noble. Yet a cold calculation tempered his thoughts. He walked to his window and looked out towards the harbor, where the masts of his own ships stood motionless, trapped by the Roman blockade. The magistrate had spoken of victory, but Demetrios saw only a city slowly consuming itself. He had seen the thinning faces of the dock workers and heard the strange quiet that had fallen over the once boisterous market districts. Pouring his grain into the war effort felt less like an investment and more like throwing precious cargo into a storm-tossed sea. It might keep the ship afloat for another day, but it would not calm the storm. While that promise of future wealth echoed in his mind, another summons arrived, this one delivered by a trusted servant in a sealed, unmarked scroll. It was an invitation to a different kind of meeting,
at the home of a fellow merchant who dealt in spices and silks. This gathering was held deep within the house, in a subterranean cellar typically used for storing wine. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and old vintages. Here sat a different council, not soldiers or politicians, but the city's economic pillars. They were bankers, ship owners, and traders whose fortunes, like his own, were tied to the lifeblood of commerce that the Romans had severed. Their leader, an old man named Philo, whose family had financed Alexandrian trade for a century, spoke with a weary pragmatism that stood in stark contrast to the magistrate's fiery rhetoric. Philo's argument was not about glory, but about preservation. He pointed out that the war was lost, regardless of how long the soldiers on the walls could be fed. Every additional day of fighting, he argued, was another day the Romans would remember when it came time to dictate terms. A city that surrendered out of starvation might be spared, but a city that had to be taken by bloody assault would be plundered, its trade privileges revoked, its people enslaved. They did not ask Demetrios to give his grain to them. Instead, they proposed something far more radical. They wanted him to release a portion of it to the public, not for sale, but for a pittance, a price so low it would be seen as a gift. The act would expose the government's inability to provide for its people. The act would expose the government's inability to provide for its people.
The implication of their plan settled heavily in the cool cellar. They were proposing to use hunger as a weapon, not against the Romans, but against Alexandria's own leadership. A sudden flood of cheap grain would create chaos. The starving populace, tasting relief for the first time in months, would turn on the commanders who had let them go hungry. Riots would erupt. The pressure would become so great that the war council would have no choice but to open the gates and negotiate a surrender. It was a treacherous path, an act of profound betrayal against the queen and her government. Yet the merchants in the room presented it as the only logical course of action, a painful surgery to save the patient from a fatal disease. They offered Demetrius not titles or glory, but a partnership in the rebuilding of the city under a new Roman order, assuring him that those who helped bring a swift end to the conflict would be rewarded by the victors. Demetrius walked back to his villa through the twilight streets, the two proposals warring within him. One offered him the title of savior in a city that might become a ruin. The other offered him the role of traitor to preserve the city as a living, breathing center of commerce. He passed a public square where a crowd was gathered around a woman who was weeping, her thin arms wrapped around a child whose listless body told its own story of hunger. He saw the faces in the crowd, gaunt and etched with a quiet despair. These were the people Agathos wanted to inspire with tales of glory, and the people Philo wanted to incite with a sudden offering of bread. He felt the weight of their collective gaze, even though none of them looked at him. They were the silent arbiters of his decision, the living consequences of the choice he had to make. He found himself standing outside one of his largest granaries, a massive stone structure near the docks. He signaled to the guard, who unbarred the heavy wooden door.
Inside, the air was dry and thick with the fine dust of wheat. The scent was clean and wholesome, a smell of life and sustenance that felt utterly alien in the starving city. Mountains of grain, protected by his foresight, rose in great sloping dunes in the dim light from the high windows. He plunged his hand deep into one of the piles, the individual grains cool and smooth against his skin. This was his power. It was the potential for thousands of loaves of bread, for porridge to fill empty bowls, for the strength to fight, or the catalyst for revolt. It was the wealth of a kingdom contained within 4 walls. For the first time, Demetrios felt the true burden of being a merchant. His entire life had been a series of transactions, of buying low and selling high, of calculated risks for predictable rewards. But this was a transaction where the currency was the city's soul, and the outcome could not be recorded in any ledger. He could side with the commanders and be remembered as a patriot who fueled a noble but doomed resistance. Or he could side with the merchants, a conspirator who forced a surrender to save the city's economic future, ensuring his own prosperity in the process. One path felt like a foolish loyalty, the other a cold and profitable betrayal. Both, in their own way, could be seen as an attempt to save Alexandria. He pulled his hand from the grain, letting the kernels cascade through his fingers. Each one represented a choice, a life, a future. He thought of the magistrate's desperate eyes and the old merchant's weary logic. He pictured the starving child in the square and the silent, trapped ships in the harbor. The city was a complex machine, and he held the key that could make it run or cause it to grind to a final, violent halt. The weight of these secret meetings had settled deep in his bones. But outside the granary walls, the slow, hungry life of a besieged Alexandria crept onward.
The great, grinding gears of the siege had slowed. After the initial fury of assaults and counter-raids, a tense quiet settled over Alexandria and the surrounding Roman encampments. The raw violence of combat had been replaced by the slow, suffocating pressure of attrition. For the soldiers on both sides, this new phase was a test of patience, a wearying routine of watchfulness under a sky that offered no relief. Sweat trickled down the backs of the Roman legionaries as they patrolled the perimeter of their meticulously constructed trenches, their movements made sluggish by the unending warmth. The monotonous days were marked not by the clash of swords, but by the relentless accounting of dwindling supplies, grain, water, and morale. This waiting game was a different kind of warfare, one fought in the mind as much as on the battlefield. Outside the city, Marcus, the centurion, walked the line of his cohort's position. The earth, baked hard, crunched under his hobnailed sandals, the sound a constant companion to his thoughts. He checked the readiness of a scorpion, a large crossbow-like artillery piece, running a hand over its tightly wound sinew ropes. He exchanged a few words with the crew, men from Gaul who joked in their own tongue about the flatness of this land compared to their forested homes. Marcus understood their need for such small comforts.
Routine and gallows humor were the shields against the gnawing boredom of a long siege. He felt the weight of his responsibility not just in directing battle, but in keeping his men focused and disciplined through this draining stalemate. It was far easier to lead a charge than to manage the slow decay of spirit that came with endless waiting. This prolonged quiet gave Marcus too much time to think. He found himself staring at the magnificent walls of Alexandria shimmering in the distance. He thought of the tribune's thirst for a quick and bloody victory, an ambition Marcus saw as wasteful. A city like this was a prize to be taken, not a ruin to be made. True Roman victory was about establishing order, not just destruction. Yet the logic of a siege was inherently cruel. He had overseen the poisoning of the outer wells and the diversion of canals, acts that felt more like a farmer destroying a rival's crop than a soldier fighting a war. He wrestled with the difference between a necessary tactic and a simple act of cruelty. This kind of warfare lacked the clean, brutal honor of a pitched battle, leaving a sour taste in his mouth that had nothing to do with the brackish water from their own camp swells. Inside those same walls, Aelia felt the consequences of Marcus's tactics in the dryness of her throat. The city's great public cisterns were either empty or so heavily guarded by the queen's soldiers that the crush of the crowd made getting a single cup a desperate struggle. Her own household supply, stored in large clay amphorae in their small courtyard, was nearly gone. Each day she measured out the water with painstaking care, giving the largest share to her youngest son, whose listlessness worried her more than the distant threat of Roman swords. Her neighbor had whispered of a small, forgotten cistern near the western wall, fed by a hidden spring. It was in a derelict area, dangerously exposed to the Roman lines, but the rumor was that the spring still flowed. The thought was a seed of dangerous hope planted in the dry soil of her desperation. That afternoon, the decision made itself. Her son's lips were cracked, and he barely stirred when she spoke his name. Clutching a small, sturdy clay jar with a faded painting of a riverbird on its side, Aelia slipped out of her home. She moved through the strangely quiet streets, her footsteps echoing in a city that was usually a loud mix of countless voices and sounds. She kept to the shadows of the grand colonnades, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. In her other hand, she gripped a small, worn charm of the household god Bess, its grotesque, protective face a familiar comfort against her palm. She told herself she was invisible, just another shadow in a city full of them. Every distant shout from the ramparts sent a jolt of fear through her, making her press herself flat against the cool stone of a building until the perceived danger passed. From his vantage point, Marcus was scanning that same derelict section of the wall. His Syrian archers, renowned for their keen eyes and deadly accuracy, were positioned nearby, their powerful composite bows resting near their hands. It was a quiet sector, but quiet sectors were often where the desperate or the foolish made their mistakes. Suddenly, his spotter touched his arm and pointed. A flicker of movement. A woman, small and quick, darting from the cover of a ruined temple towards a cluster of overgrown palms where the hidden cistern must be. She was dressed in the simple blue linen common to the city's working families. The archers saw her too. The soft creak of their bows being drawn was the only sound in the still air. Standard procedure was clear. Anyone moving in the no-man's land between the lines was a potential messenger, a spy, or, at the very least, a source of sustenance for the enemy. The woman reached the cistern. Marcus watched through a small looking-glass made of polished bronze. He could see her clearly now. She was thin, her movements filled with a frantic energy as she knelt to dip her jar into the water. For an instant, the sun caught the water as it splashed, a brief, bright sparkle in the dusty landscape. It was in that moment that Marcus did not see an enemy. He saw his own wife, Julia, drawing water from the well in the courtyard of their small home near Rome. He imagined his 2 sons running to her, thirsty from their games. The thought was so clear, so vivid, that it struck him with physical force. His archers waited, their bowstrings tight, their eyes fixed on him for the signal. The logic of the siege demanded he give it. A single dead woman might not matter, but the water she carried would sustain a soldier or a soldier's child for another day.
He lowered his hand, palm down. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but his men understood it instantly. There was a faint sigh of released tension as the archers relaxed their draw. One of them, a young, ambitious soldier named Cassius, looked at Marcus with a question in his eyes. He saw not a strategic target, but a civilian, and his commander's choice confused him. Marcus ignored the look. He kept his own eyes on the woman, watching as she scrambled back towards the safety of the wall, her jar now heavy with its precious contents. He had made a choice that went against the cold calculus of war, a small act of rebellion against the brutal necessities of his profession. He told himself it was a matter of discipline. An arrow was not to be wasted on such a minor target. But he knew, in a place deeper than discipline, that it was not true. Aaliyah felt no arrow. She had braced for it, for the sharp, piercing finality she had seen strike soldiers on the walls. She ran with her head down, her lungs burning, expecting at any moment to feel that searing pain in her back. But all she felt was the strain in her arms from the weight of the water and the rough ground beneath her worn sandals. When she finally tumbled back through a breach in a low wall into the relative safety of the city streets, she leaned against the stone, her body trembling uncontrollably. She did not understand. Was it a miracle? Had the gods shielded her? The mercy was as terrifying as the threat had been. A moment of inexplicable humanity from an enemy she knew only as a faceless force of destruction. She looked down at the water sloshing in the jar, its surface reflecting the sliver of blue sky above. It seemed more precious than gold.
Back in the Roman camp, Cassius finally worked up the courage to approach his centurion. "Sir," he began, his voice hesitant, "the woman. We could have—" Marcus cut him off, not with anger, but with a weary sigh. He clapped the young man on the shoulder. "Cassius," he said, turning to look him in the eye, "there are 1,000 ways to win a siege. Wasting good Syrian arrows on a thirsty mother isn't one of them. Worry about the state of the forward latrine trench. That's a battle we can actually win today." The other soldiers who overheard chuckled, and Cassius, though still a little confused, nodded and went on his way. Marcus had restored the familiar order of military life, turning a moment of profound moral complexity into a simple joke about camp sanitation. He had kept his authority, and he had kept his secret mercy to himself. As evening began to settle, the harsh light softened, and a slight breeze stirred the dust. Aelia returned to her home, the full water jar a triumphant burden. She poured a small amount into a cup and gently lifted her son's head, helping him drink. He sipped the cool, clean water, and for the first time in days, a flicker of awareness returned to his eyes. Aelia watched him, a wave of profound relief washing over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. The fear and the danger of the day melted away in that one simple act of providing comfort. With the day's light fading, Aelia found a fragile sense of peace in the quiet rhythms of caring for her family, a small, protected world she had risked everything to maintain. The long nights on the walls had grown colder, and the small fires the soldiers were allowed felt more like points of companionship than sources of actual warmth. Lycos pulled his thin wool cloak tighter, the rough fabric scratching his neck as he huddled with the men of his unit. They used whatever they could find for fuel, splintered planks from damaged carts, the occasional broken piece of furniture from a nearby building. The wood was often damp or green, and it hissed in the flames, releasing a bitter smoke that made his eyes sting and water. They had long ago stopped talking of home, of wives or children. Such thoughts were a luxury that belonged to a world with full bellies and peaceful nights, a world that seemed to be receding with every passing day. Instead, their conversations had shrunk, becoming as small and uncertain as their flickering fires.
This quiet was broken by Philon, a grizzled veteran whose face was a map of old campaigns. He spat a piece of grit from his mouth and stared into the fire, his voice low and gravelly. "I heard from a man in the harbor guard," he began, and everyone leaned in slightly, desperate for any news, any story to fill the silence. "They took one of our patrols last week. The Romans, they didn't just kill them, they made an example. Tied one to a post outside their main gate as a warning." He paused, letting the image settle in the minds of the younger soldiers. A shiver passed through Lycus that had nothing to do with the night's chill. The thought of such a fate, of being reduced to a mere message, was a fear deeper than that of a quick death in battle. However, another soldier, a young man from the Delta named Ammon, shook his head, his face illuminated by the unsteady orange light. "That's not what I heard," he countered, his voice earnest. "My brother's friend serves with the Eastern Gate garrison. He said a man who swam the canal to desert told his family the Romans are offering land, good farmland in Hispania, and full citizenship for any soldier who brings his equipment and joins them." This second story hung in the air, a complete opposite to the first. It offered a future, a way out that wasn't death or disgrace. One tale promised a terrible end, the other an impossible new beginning. The men fell silent again, each one turning these conflicting possibilities over in his mind, trying to decide which was the truth and which was the lie. Just then, a soft thump
sounded on the stone walkway not far from their fire. It was a sound they were becoming used to. Lycus went to investigate, his sandals scraping on the stone. He found a small, tightly rolled piece of papyrus, weighted with a small stone and tied with a string. He brought it back to the firelight, his fingers fumbling with the knot. Unrolling it, he saw words written in clean, simple Greek, the kind a merchant would use, not a scholar. The message was direct. It promised safety to all who surrendered. It spoke of plentiful Roman grain and a swift end to the suffering. It addressed them not as enemies, but as fellow men caught in a queen's foolish war. Lycus read the words aloud, his voice quiet. The pamphlet didn't feel like a weapon, yet its effect was as powerful as any catapult stone, for it struck not at the walls of the city, but at the certainty within each man's heart.
He found himself torn, adrift on a sea of whispers and written promises. He looked from the hard, grim face of Philon to the hopeful expression on Ammon's. Who was he to believe? The veteran who saw only Roman cruelty, or the young farmer who dreamed of a Roman reward? Part of him clung to his oath, to the simple loyalty he had always known. He was a soldier of Alexandria. He defended his home. Yet the memory of his sister's thin face at their last meeting, the gnawing emptiness in his own stomach, and the straightforward promise on the papyrus all combined to form a powerful argument against that simple duty. The war was no longer just a contest of shields and spears. It had become a battle of stories, and he was losing. While Lycos wrestled with tales designed to break his resolve, Marcus was watching similar tales being constructed on the other side of the wall. In the spacious command tent, warmed by several clean-burning oil lamps, a young tribune addressed a gathering of centurions. He was a man from a powerful family in Rome, his ambition as polished and sharp as his ceremonial breastplate. He paced before them, his voice ringing with conviction as he painted a picture of the city they were fighting. He didn't speak of tactics or supply lines. Instead, he spoke of Alexandrian character. He described them as a people weakened by luxury, their men more interested in philosophical debates than in honest work, their women decadent and immoral. He told stories of their foreign-born queen, calling her a serpent who had poisoned the great legacy of the city's founder. He spoke of the great library not as a center of learning, but as a hoard of useless knowledge, a place where men grew pale reading scrolls while the rest of the world toiled under the sun. Marcus stood with his arms crossed, his face impassive. He had spent time in Alexandria during a tour of duty years before the siege. He remembered the hard-working fishermen in the harbor, the skilled artisans in their workshops, and the loud, laughing children in the streets. The city the Tribune described was a caricature, a grotesque drawing meant to inspire contempt and hatred. Yet Marcus could not deny the effectiveness of the Tribune's words. He watched the faces of the other centurions, especially the younger ones. Their jaws were set, their eyes hardened. These stories gave them a reason to fight that went beyond simple obedience. It made the enemy less human, transforming them from people defending their homes into symbols of corruption that needed to be cleansed. It simplified the grim business of war,
turning a complex city into a simple target. It was a necessary tool, Marcus told himself. An army fought better when it believed its cause was not just political, but moral. This was how you motivated men to leave their own farms and families and endure the sand, the sickness, and the terror of an assault. Still, the practice left a sour feeling in his gut, a moral compromise that sat uneasily within him. He felt a quiet shame, as if he were complicit in a great lie. He knew the truth was far more complicated. The people of Alexandria were just people, some noble, some base, most somewhere in between, just like the people of Rome. But war did not have room for such complexities. For the legionary in the trench, shivering through another cold night, the enemy had to be worthy of his hatred. The tribune's exaggerated tales provided that justification, sharpening the legion's will into a finer point. This strategy was a weapon with two edges. In the same way the tribune's stories hardened his own men, Marcus knew the pamphlets they fired over the walls were designed to soften their opponents. One set of words was meant to build a wall of anger and resolve within the Roman camp, while the other was meant to create cracks of doubt and despair within the city's defenses. It was a siege fought on two fronts, the physical one of stone and wood, and the invisible one of the human mind. Every rumor, every promise, every lie was a carefully aimed projectile, and he was one of the officers directing the fire.
He thought of the Alexandrian soldier who might be reading one of their pamphlets at that very moment. He wondered if that man had a family, if he was hungry, if he was afraid. He wondered if the simple promise of safety would be enough to make him lay down his spear. The tribune finished his speech to nods of grim approval from the other officers. They were ready to fight, their minds filled with images of a corrupt city ripe for conquest. Marcus nodded along with them, playing his part. The intricate web of stories and deceptions that surrounded him in the tent felt both shockingly new and as old as warfare itself. The grinding of siege engines and the distant clash of skirmishes had become a familiar, almost rhythmic part of life, a sound one could learn to ignore. This new enemy, however, arrived in silence. It began not with a trumpet's call, but with a child's cough, a dry, rasping sound that echoed too loudly in the small rooms of Alia's home. At first, she dismissed it as a simple cold, brought on by the damp nights and the thin broth that now served as their evening meal. But when her youngest son's skin grew hot to the touch and his breathing became a shallow, rapid effort, a different kind of fear took hold. It was a cold dread that no wall could keep out, a terror far more personal than a Roman legionary on the ramparts. Aelia pressed a damp cloth to her son's forehead, feeling the unnatural warmth seep into the fabric. The child barely stirred, his eyes half closed and clouded. She tried to coax a spoonful of watered-down honey between his lips, but he turned his head away with a weak moan. The air in the room felt heavy in her lungs, each breath a conscious task. She moved to unlatch the shutters, hoping for a breeze, but the world outside offered no relief, only the same still, quiet heat of a city holding its breath. This helplessness was a new and terrifying weight,
heavier than the constant worry over the dwindling sacks of grain in her storage room. A soldier could be fought, a wall could be defended, but this was a foe that had already breached their innermost defenses.
Desperate, she sought out the neighborhood healer, an old woman whose hands were stained with a lifetime of herbs. The healer's shelves, however, were nearly bare. She offered Alia a small pouch of dried feverfew, her face etched with apology. "It is all I have left," she explained, her voice a weary whisper. "The supply ships no longer arrive, and the fields beyond the walls are lost to us." As Alia walked home, clutching the small pouch, she heard the same dry coughing from other doorways. She saw other mothers with the same hunted look in their eyes, a shared recognition of the invisible siege now being laid upon their families. It was no longer just the Romans they fought. It was a shadow creeping through the streets, touching one household and then the next. This unseen adversary knew no allegiance and respected no battle lines. Beyond the great stone walls of Alexandria, the Roman camp was also beginning to feel its grip. Centurion Marcus stood over a long trench, the rhythmic scrape of shovels against hard-packed earth the only sound in the afternoon stillness. His men were not digging fortifications or siege works. They were digging a new latrine, far from the tents and the precious water supply. A grim-faced legionary approached him, his movements stiff. "Another dozen men down with the flux this morning, sir," he reported, not meeting Marcus's eyes. "The Medici says it's the water from the last well we dug. He thinks it's tainted." Marcus nodded, a knot tightening in his gut. He had seen this before in other campaigns. An army could withstand arrows and swords, but once its bowels turned to water, it began to devour itself from within. He walked through the camp, his gaze sharp and practical. He saw men moving slowly, their faces pale and slick with sweat. He heard the low groans coming from the infirmary tent, a sound that unsettled him more than any battle cry. The tribune, still focused on glory, demanded plans for the next assault, but Marcus found his thoughts consumed by logistics of a different kind: boiling water, enforcing sanitation, and isolating the sick. He felt like a man trying to repair a leaky ship in the middle of a storm, plugging one hole only for two more to appear. The daily reports laid out the stark reality. On one side of the parchment was the list of men lost in the latest skirmish: 3 dead, 7 wounded. On the other side, the tally from the Medici was far longer: 23 new cases of dysentery, 4 dead from fever. The numbers were relentless, growing each day. Marcus looked out at the magnificent city, its lighthouse a silent beacon against the sky. He had come here to conquer a city of stone and people, but he was now locked in a desperate struggle against something he could not see, an enemy that weakened his legion more effectively than any Alexandrian sortie. His men had a joke, a bitter piece of camp humor. They were more likely to be felled by a bad drink of water than by a Ptolemaic spear. Inside the city, the whispers of the people took on a new tone of despair. The priests made offerings at the temples, their chants rising in the quiet streets, but the gods seemed deaf to their pleas. The lack of clean water and the meager rations of old grain were taking their toll. People began to eye their neighbors with suspicion, wondering if the sickness could be passed by a simple touch or a shared breath. The strong community that had banded together in the first weeks of the siege was beginning to fray at the edges, worn thin by hunger and now by disease. Community gatherings in the public squares became less frequent, as families chose to remain in their homes, hoping to keep the invisible enemy outside their doors. For Aelia, the world had shrunk to the four walls of the small room where her son lay. His fever had not broken. She spent her days and nights bathing his skin, whispering stories he was too weak to hear, and praying to any god who might listen. Greek, Egyptian, it did not matter. She remembered an old tale her grandmother used to tell about a smooth, dark stone from the river that could draw a fever out of the body. In her desperation, she found such a stone and placed it gently on her son's small chest, a gesture rooted not in knowledge, but in the profound need to do something. The stone remained cool against his hot skin, a small, solid point of hope in an ocean of helplessness. Meanwhile, in the Roman camp, Marcus made a difficult decision. He ordered a full tenth of their remaining grain rations to be used to make a weak fermented drink called pasca. It was a sour mix of water and vinegar, but the vinegar had a way of killing the impurities in the water, making it safer to drink. The men grumbled about the taste and the reduced bread rations, but Marcus held firm. A soldier with a sour drink is better than a dead soldier, he told his junior officers, his voice leaving no room for argument. It was a strategic retreat, not from the enemy on the walls, but from the enemy within their own bodies. That evening, as Aelia watched her son, she noticed a change. The heat radiating from his skin seemed less intense. He stirred, and his eyes opened, no longer clouded, but aware. He looked at her and whispered a single word: water. Relief washed over her so powerfully her knees felt weak. She quickly brought him a cup, her hands trembling as she held it to his lips. He drank, his small throat working, and for the first time in days, a fragile hope began to push back against the despair that had filled her home. The sickness had not vanished from the city, nor from the Roman camp. It lingered in the narrow streets and the crowded tents, a constant, draining presence that sapped the strength of both sides equally. The great siege had become a war of endurance on a new front. It was no longer a simple contest of walls and weapons, but a grim battle of attrition fought in sickbeds and latrine trenches, a battle against an enemy that could not be seen, reasoned with, or intimidated. The grand strategies of generals and the courage of soldiers seemed small in the face of such an elemental and impartial foe. For Marcus, the nightly count of the sick was a stark reminder of his own vulnerability. A general fighting a war with weapons he did not understand. He had been trained to break formations, to exploit weaknesses in a wall, but he had no strategy for this. All he could do was enforce the simple, brutal arithmetic of survival. More latrines, boiled water, and rest for the afflicted. He felt the immense, impersonal weight of command settle on him, a responsibility not just for victory, but for the very lives of the men who trusted him. Aelia held her son's small hand, feeling the faint, steady pulse beneath his skin. The fever had receded, leaving him weak but alive. She knew they were not safe.
that the hunger and the sickness still prowled the city like starving wolves. Yet, in the quiet of the room, she felt a fierce, protective resolve harden within her. She had faced the unseen enemy, and for now, she had won. In the growing twilight, Aelia carried the weary relief of the day's small victory with her, a fragile shield against the uncertainties of the night. The silence of the false dawn was the first warning. For months, the mornings had been broken by the distant sounds of the Roman camp, hammers on metal, the calls of sentries, the grinding of supply wagons. But this morning, a heavy quietness pressed down, a silence that felt more threatening than any noise. Lycos stood on the wall, his knuckles white around the shaft of his spear, and watched the gray light slowly reveal the monster the Romans had built in the dark. It was a tower, a wooden behemoth on wheels, taller than the city walls themselves. Its slow, grinding advance was the only sound in the world, a deep groan of wood and earth that vibrated through the stone beneath his sandals. The men around him shifted their weight, their own silence a mix of fear and resolve. Commands were passed in hushed, urgent tones, and the scrape of sandals on stone was the only reply.
As the tower drew closer, the quiet broke apart into 1,000 sharp noises. The first was the deep thrum of Roman war horns, a sound designed to unnerve, to make the heart hammer against the ribs. Lycus felt the vibration in his own chest, a physical response to the enemy's call. Then came the orders from his own commanders, their voices raw and loud, trying to cut through the growing din. Men rushed past him carrying heavy pots of oil and sand. The air grew acrid with the smell of pitch being heated over braziers, the smoke making his eyes water and his throat clench. He gripped his shield, the familiar weight a small comfort as the tower, a moving fortress filled with men, finally groaned to a halt against their section of the wall. For a single breathless moment, there was a pause, a collective intake of breath along the rampart. Then the drawbridge of the tower slammed down onto the stone with a crash that shook the foundations, and the world dissolved into shouting and the clash of metal. From a high window in the library district, Theon the scholar watched the distant battle. The sounds that were so immediate and overwhelming for Lycus were, for him, a muted roar, like the sea crashing against the heptastadion during a storm. He could not make out individual men, only the great, slow-moving shape of the siege tower and the ant-like swarms of soldiers clashing on the walls. It was a terrifying, almost beautiful sight, a living map of conflict spread out below him. He saw the tiny flickers of fire as flaming arrows were exchanged, and the plumes of dark smoke where burning oil had found its mark. Theon's hand rested on a half-copied manuscript of Thucydides, the historian who had written of another great war centuries ago. He found himself tracing the elegant Greek letters describing sieges and slaughters, his mind struggling to connect the calm, ordered words on the page with the brutal reality unfolding before his eyes. It felt like watching a history being written, not with ink, but with blood. Back on the wall, Lycos had no time for such thoughts.
His world had shrunk to the few feet of stone in front of him. A Roman legionary, face hidden behind the menacing bars of his helmet, lunged at him from the tower's bridge. Lycos caught the blow on his shield, the impact a jarring shock that ran up his arm and rattled his teeth. He pushed back, using the shield's weight, and thrust with his spear. There was no glory in it, no feeling of victory, only a grim satisfaction as the soldier fell back. But another immediately took his place. The fight was a machine, an endless series of movements: block, push, thrust. Sweat dripped into his eyes, blurring his vision, and his arm ached with a deep, burning fatigue. The shouts around him were no longer words, just raw sounds of exertion and pain. He no longer thought of the Queen, or of Alexandria, or even of tomorrow. His entire existence was focused on staying upright and keeping the man in front of him from taking the next step. The pressure on the wall was immense. The Romans were disciplined, pushing forward in tight formations, their large rectangular shields, the scuta, forming a solid wall of wood and steel. Lycos and his comrades were fighting with a different energy, a desperate defense of their homes. They used long pikes to try and push the siege tower away, while others hurled down heavy stones and pots of burning oil. One pot fell short, splashing flaming liquid onto the rampart near Lycos. The heat was immediate and intense, forcing him back a step. For a moment, the attackers gained a foothold. A centurion with a transverse crest on his helmet bellowed orders in Latin, and a handful of his men surged onto the wall. The Alexandrian line buckled. It was a man named Diogenes, a fisherman Lycos had shared wine with just a few nights before, who stopped the breach. With a desperate roar, he charged the centurion, and for a few vital seconds, the two men were locked in a deadly struggle, giving the defenders time to rally.
Watching from his distant perch, Theon saw the small, localized crisis on the wall. He saw the slight dip in the defensive line, the small cluster of darker Roman tunics mixing with the lighter linen of the city guard. From his perspective, it was a subtle shift in the pattern, a ripple in the fabric of the conflict. He watched as the ripple was contained, the darker shapes pushed back. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were observing a colony of insects. He knew that each of those tiny figures was a man, with a family, with hopes, with a life that was now being gambled away on a few feet of sun-baked stone. The knowledge was a cold weight in his stomach. He turned away from the window, unable to watch any longer. The quiet of the library, the scent of old papyrus and cedar oil, felt like a world away, a fragile sanctuary that this wave of violence threatened to wash away completely. He wondered if this was how all history felt to those who lived it, a chaotic, senseless struggle that only made sense when written down long after the fact. The struggle for the wall raged for hours. Lycos lost all track of time. His body moved on its own, driven by instinct and training. He felt the jarring impact of a sword that glanced off his helmet, leaving his ears ringing and his head swimming. He saw Diogenes fall, a Roman javelin, a pilum embedded in his chest. There was no time to mourn, no time for anything but the next enemy, the next shield to block, the next spear thrust. The defenders began to use Greek fire,
a terrifying substance that clung to shields and armor and could not be extinguished with water. The screams of the men caught in the sticky flames were a new and horrifying sound that cut through the general noise of battle. The Romans, for all their discipline, recoiled from this weapon, their advance faltering for the first time. This brief respite gave the Alexandrians a chance.
Seizing the moment, the defenders mounted a desperate counterattack. Led by their commander, they surged forward, pushing the remaining Romans off the wall and back onto the siege tower's bridge. Lycos found a new reserve of strength, his weariness replaced by a surge of adrenaline. He shouted with the others, the sound a raw expression of defiance. They fought with a ferocity that stunned the attackers, pushing them back inch by inch. They threw grappling hooks onto the siege tower itself and pulled, trying to topple the great machine. For a time, it seemed impossible. But then, with a great groaning of timbers, the tower began to tilt. A cheer went up from the defenders as the huge structure, the focus of the day's entire battle, slowly, majestically, leaned away from the wall and then crashed to the ground in a cloud of dust and splintered wood. The sudden silence that followed the tower's collapse was as shocking as the noise had been. On the wall, men stood panting, leaning on their spears, staring in disbelief at the wreckage below. The Roman assault had been broken. Lycos looked at the faces of the men around him. They were covered in soot, sweat, and blood. Some were wounded. Others simply stared blankly, their bodies still trembling from the fight. He felt a profound sense of connection to them, a bond forged in the heat of a shared struggle for survival. They had not been fighting for a queen or a city. They had been fighting for each other. He took a long, ragged breath, the simple act of filling his lungs feeling like a victory in itself. The taste of dust and smoke was still in his mouth, a bitter reminder of how close they had all come to the end.
In the library, Theon heard the distant cheer. He returned to the window and saw the ruined siege tower, a broken skeleton of wood lying at the base of the wall. The tide of the battle had turned. He felt a wave of relief so powerful it left him weak. But it was followed by a deeper sorrow. The victory had been won, but the siege was not over. He looked down at the scroll on his table, its neat lines of text a testament to order and reason. He picked up his stylus, a thin reed pen, but his hand trembled too much to write. All the knowledge contained in this building, all the philosophy and science seemed so fragile in the face of such raw, destructive force. Theon carefully put the stylus down, the need to preserve this knowledge feeling more urgent than ever. He would record what he had seen, not as a celebration of victory, but as a warning. The scholar settled back at his desk, the quiet of the room a stark contrast to the recent chaos. The evening would require its own kind of resilience. The fierce shouts and the ringing clash of metal faded slowly, leaving an ache in Lycos's bones deeper than any single wound. His shield arm throbbed from the constant jarring impacts, and his ears hummed with the phantom cries of the battle. Yet, as he and his fellow soldiers slumped against the parapet, a weary pride settled over them. They had held the great Roman siege tower,
a monster of wood and iron, was a smoldering ruin at the base of the wall, its assault repelled by their sweat and blood. A man next to him, his face black with soot, managed a cracked-lipped grin. He passed a water skin to Lycos, and the tepid, stale liquid was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. For the first time in weeks, a fragile sense of victory warmed them more than the fading daylight. While Lycos and his comrades savored their brief respite, Demetrios sat in a windowless room deep within the city's commercial heart. The air was cool and smelled of stored papyrus and dried herbs, a scent he usually found comforting. Tonight, it did little to calm the frantic beating in his chest. Across a heavy wooden table sat 3 other men, their faces etched with the same hunger and fear that haunted every citizen of Alexandria. These were not soldiers or politicians, but men like him, merchants and landowners whose fortunes were tied to the city's survival. One of them, a ship owner named Ptolemy, argued in a low, urgent voice. He spoke of starvation, of the sickness in the poorer quarters, and of the pointlessness of watching their children waste away for a queen's pride. Ptolemy's words resonated with the cold logic that Demetrios had been wrestling with for weeks. To continue this fight meant certain destruction. The city's great spirit was being bled dry, one life at a time. A negotiated peace, even a surrender, would at least preserve the city itself, its people, its future. He looked at the other men's faces, seeing his own grim calculations reflected there. They believed this act was not one of treachery, but of painful necessity, a surgeon's cut to save the patient. Demetrios found himself nodding slowly, the decision settling upon him with the weight of a burial shroud. He told himself over and over that he was choosing to save Alexandria, not betray it. This decision led them from the quiet meeting room into the city's hidden veins. Demetrios carried a single oil lamp, its small flame pushing back a darkness that felt ancient and absolute. They descended a set of worn stone steps into a network of tunnels beneath the market district. The air grew damp and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth, and something else, something metallic and stagnant. These were passages known only to a few, built for moving goods discreetly from warehouses to the harbor, bypassing the crowded streets above. Their footsteps echoed strangely, muffled by the sheer weight of the city resting on their shoulders. One of the men stumbled, his hand scraping against the rough-hewn wall, and the sound made Demetrius's heart leap into his throat. Their journey through the suffocating blackness ended at a wall of thick, timbered planks reinforced with iron. This was the Sea Gate, a minor, almost forgotten entrance used by smugglers and fishermen in quieter times. Its existence was a secret held tightly by the city's commercial families. As the other men put their shoulders to the heavy crossbar, Demetrius's hands trembled so badly he could barely hold the lamp steady. He thought of his own granaries, full and secure, and of the price of his family's safety. The bar groaned in protest, the sound of rust grinding against stone, a painful shriek in the silence. It felt like the sound of a city's soul tearing.
Then, with a final, shuddering thud, the lock gave way. Back on the walls, Lycos' unit received new orders. A commander, his face flushed with the day's success, informed them they were being reassigned. Their section of the wall, the site of the fiercest fighting, would be reinforced by fresh troops. They were to move to the eastern ramparts near the royal harbor, a sector that had been quiet for months. A wave of relief washed over the exhausted soldiers. They slapped each other on the back, their movements slow and pained, and made jokes about sleeping for a week. As Lycos shouldered his spear and began the long walk along the stone thoroughfare, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. They had faced the worst Rome could throw at them, and had won. The thought of a quiet posting was a reward beyond measure. They settled into their new position as a deep, star-filled night blanketed the city. The air coming off the harbor was cool and carried the familiar scent of salt and fish. For a few hours, a semblance of peace returned. Lycos leaned against the cool stone of the battlements, watching the Roman campfires glitter in the distance like a malevolent constellation. He allowed himself to think of the future, of what life might be like after the siege was broken. He pictured the markets full again, the ships returning to the harbor, the simple, vibrant life of his city restored. A profound weariness settled into his limbs, and he fought to keep his eyes open, his head nodding forward.
It was not a trumpet or a war cry that shattered the calm, but a different sound, one that did not belong. From deep within the city, behind them, came the noise of disciplined shouting and the sharp, rhythmic clang of metal on pavement. Lycos straightened up, his blood turning to ice. Every soldier on the wall with him froze, their heads turning not towards the enemy outside, but towards their own homes. The sounds were unmistakable, the clipped commands of a Roman centurion, the heavy, coordinated tramp of legionary sandals on stone. It was impossible. It was a nightmare. The enemy was not at the gates. They were already inside. A chilling realization washed over him, more devastating than any physical blow. They hadn't been moved as a reward. They had been moved to clear the way. While they had been fighting and dying at the main wall, a door had been opened somewhere else. Someone had let the Romans in. The pride he had felt only hours before curdled into a bitter, burning shame. He looked at the faces of his comrades, lit by the flickering torchlight, and saw the same look of stunned disbelief and hollow despair. They had been utterly and completely betrayed. The sounds of the organized Roman advance grew louder, spreading through the streets like a fire through dry reeds. Cries of alarm and panic began to rise from the city's residential quarters, a wave of terror rolling towards them. Lycos gripped his spear, his knuckles white, but he no longer knew which way to point it. His enemy was supposed to be in front of him, across the wall. Now the threat was everywhere, a poison injected directly into the heart of Alexandria. He could see the distant flicker of more torches, moving in disciplined formations through the city grid.
From his new vantage point on the quiet wall, Lycos watched as the standards of the legions, the eagles and the boars, were raised over a captured gatehouse far below. Each one that rose in the night was another nail in his city's coffin. The fighting he could hear was sporadic and desperate, the sound of a city guard being overwhelmed in its sleep. The strategic genius of the move was horrifyingly clear. The city's best defenders had been drawn to a single point, celebrated a meaningless victory, and then were left isolated and useless as the true attack unfolded from within. His body ached with a fatigue that had nothing to do with battle. It was the weariness of a spirit broken by treachery. Around the harbor, the gentle lapping of water against the stone quays continued its ancient, indifferent rhythm. A strange quiet had settled over Alexandria, a silence more unsettling than the roar of siege engines. Marcus walked the broad colonnaded street, his footsteps echoing where thousands had once bustled. The weight of his armor, a familiar comfort in the heat of battle, now felt like a crushing burden on his tired shoulders. His legionaries, posted at intersections, did not stand with the sharp pride of conquerors. They leaned on their spears, their faces streaked with grime and exhaustion, their gazes vacant. There were no victory parades, no triumphant marches through the city gates. Instead, there was only the immense weariness of a task completed. Looking at the grand facades of the buildings, some blackened by fire, others pocked by stones from the catapults, he felt a profound hollowness. This was the prize, this wounded and subdued metropolis, and the cost had been etched into the bones of every man, Roman and Alexandrian alike. This new, imposed quiet reached into every home. Alia, who had spent months listening for the whistle of arrows or the distant crash of a collapsing wall, found the silence unnerving. She held her son's small hand, his fever finally broken, and ventured out of their small apartment. The air no longer carried the sharp, acrid smell of smoke. Instead, a faint scent of stagnant water and dust lingered. In the main square, a scene she could not have imagined a week ago was unfolding. Roman soldiers, the very men who had been the source of her terror, were ladling clean water from large barrels into the jars of a long, orderly line of citizens. As she took her place, she saw the crimson banners with their golden eagles hanging from the public buildings, stark against the pale stone. A part of her felt a deep, aching sorrow for the lost sovereignty of her city. But as a soldier filled her jug, the simple relief of having enough water for the day was so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes.
From this scene of practical survival, a different kind of restoration was underway. Theon pushed open the heavy bronze doors of the great library, the grating sound echoing in the cavernous main hall. Sunlight streamed through a gaping hole in the roof, illuminating a mess of overturned shelves, scattered scrolls, and a fine layer of gray ash over everything. His first breath inside was a painful mix of dust and the ghost of smoke, a scent that made his throat tighten with memory. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over him as he surveyed the damage. But then he saw it. A section of shelves against a far wall, miraculously untouched,
the papyrus rolls still neatly stacked in their cubbies. He walked toward them, his steps careful amidst the debris. He reached out and picked up a scroll, its wooden toggles smooth and cool in his hand. It was a treatise on geometry, a work of pure logic and order. In that moment, his purpose, which had felt so fragile during the siege, solidified once more. He would not mourn what was lost. He would dedicate his life to preserving what remained. While Theon focused on preserving the city's intellectual soul, Demetrios was busy securing its commercial future, or at least his part in it. He sat across a polished table from a Roman quaestor, a man in charge of financial matters, in an office that had once belonged to one of the queen's chief administrators. The Roman was pragmatic, his questions sharp and direct, concerned only with grain reserves, shipping manifests, and tax revenues. Demetrios answered calmly, providing the ledgers he had so carefully maintained. He felt a strange detachment as he pledged his resources to the new order, justifying his actions as the only logical path forward. He had saved his family, protected his wealth, and perhaps, he told himself, helped prevent the city's complete destruction. The quaestor seemed satisfied, stamping a document with a wax seal that granted Demetrios official protection and designated him a key supplier for the Roman garrison. He had survived, and he would even prosper.
With the stamped parchment tucked safely in his tunic, Demetrius left the administrative quarter and walked toward the agora, the central marketplace. The familiar sounds were beginning to return, though muted. A few merchants were setting up their stalls, their movements slow and tentative. He saw faces he recognized, men and women he had done business with for years. As he passed, a baker he knew nodded stiffly, his eyes holding a flicker of something Demetrius could not quite decipher. Was it resentment or simply exhaustion? An old woman selling olives turned away as he approached, busying herself with rearranging her display. He realized then that while the Roman seal in his tunic protected his property, it could not protect him from the judgment of his own people. The knowledge settled in his gut, a cold, heavy stone. This chilling realization followed him through the market, where the air was slowly starting to carry the scents of spices and baking bread again. He saw Lycos, the young soldier, no longer in armor, but in a simple linen tunic, helping a stonemason clear rubble from a damaged storefront. The boy's shoulders were slumped, the easy confidence he once had replaced by a quiet, hardened weariness. Their eyes met for a brief second across the square. Lycos's gaze was not accusatory, not filled with the fire of betrayal Demetrius had feared. It was worse. It was empty, a look that conveyed a loss so profound that blame was an irrelevant emotion. Lycos simply looked through him, as if Demetrius were just another part of the changed landscape, another broken piece of the city that could never be put back together in the same way. Across the city, Marcus stood on the steps of the Serapeum, the grand temple complex, looking out over the sprawling metropolis. His tribune, the ambitious young officer, spoke of consolidating their power and sending triumphant reports back to Rome. But Marcus wasn't listening. He was watching the people below, seeing the slow, determined effort of life reasserting itself.
He saw a child chase a stray dog, his laughter a fragile, hopeful sound. He saw two men working together to lift a fallen piece of a marble column from a pathway. It was a city of immense resilience, a place that had absorbed conquerors before, and would likely absorb them now, blending their ways into its own ancient and complex identity. He wondered if Rome truly understood what it had taken, not just in lives and gold, but in spirit. He felt less like a conqueror and more like a custodian of a great wounded creature.
This sense of custodianship was taking a different form for Theon. Back in the library, he had gathered a small group of his fellow scholars. They worked in silence, their robes smudged with ash, carefully sorting through the debris. For every scroll they found ruined, its edges charred, or its text hopelessly smeared, they found another that was merely damaged. Patiently, they began the work of cleaning, repairing, and re-cataloging. The task was enormous, a labor that would take years, perhaps the rest of their lives. Yet there was no despair in their actions. Each salvaged fragment felt like a small victory against the chaos, a quiet act of defiance. Theon knew that the future of Alexandria would not be decided by the soldiers in the streets or the merchants in the markets alone. It would also be shaped here, in the patient hands of those who tended to its memory. Aelia, meanwhile, brought her clean water home. In the evening, she sat with her children, telling them an old story, a myth about gods and heroes from a time long before the Romans, even before the great Alexander himself. Her voice was soft in the small room, a thread of continuity in a world that had been torn apart. She spoke of resilience and cleverness, of mortals who outwitted fate. It was what her mother had done for her, and her grandmother before that. The Roman standards might fly from the towers, and foreign soldiers might patrol the streets. But here, in the quiet of her home, she held on to the core of their world. She was not a scholar, or a soldier, or a merchant. She was a mother, and her task was to ensure that the stories, the very essence of who they were, would be carried forward into the uncertain dawn. That night, Demetrius stood on his rooftop, looking out over the city. The great lighthouse, the Pharos, still sent its beam of light out across the dark water, a steadfast and unchanging beacon. He had made his choices. He had navigated the treacherous currents of the siege, and had brought his family and his fortune safely to the other side. Yet the cost was a heavy one. The silent judgment in the eyes of his neighbors, the hollow feeling of a prosperity built upon the city's defeat. These were debts that could not be easily paid. He had gambled that Alexandria would fall, and he had won. But as he watched that unwavering light sweep across the sea, he wondered if, in saving himself, he had lost a part of himself he could never get back. Marcus, too, was watching the lighthouse from the ramparts of the city wall. For him, it was a symbol of the immense wealth and history of the place he now controlled. The siege was over, but the occupation was just beginning. He thought of the long years ahead, of governing a people so fiercely proud and intellectually vibrant. It would be a different kind of war,
One fought not with swords and shields, but with laws, taxes, and cultural assimilation. It was a challenge that filled him with a sense of immense responsibility and a deep, abiding weariness. The fighting was done, but the work of Rome had only just begun, and its shadow would be a long one. Theon worked late into the night, the soft glow of a single oil lamp illuminating his painstaking work. He carefully unrolled a fragile piece of papyrus, its edges crumbling at his touch. He was not thinking of the Romans or the fallen queen. He was thinking only of the words written there, a voice from centuries past that had almost been silenced forever. The familiar scent of old papyrus and ink lingered in the quiet hall, a comfort as he reflected on all that had been lost and all that, against the odds, been saved. And so, our journey through the siege of Alexandria comes to its conclusion. The final clashes have subsided, and a stillness settles over the great Egyptian port. Picture the harbor, no longer churning with the oars of Roman triremes, but reflecting the serene and silent constellations. The great Pharos lighthouse, which once guided ships through the chaos of conflict, now casts its steady, sweeping beam across a city at peace. The arguments of Caesar and the Ptolemies have faded, their strategies and ambitions now quiet echoes preserved in the histories we've explored. Just as that long and arduous struggle found its resolution, allow the day's own demands to find their end. Let the story of this ancient conflict be a reminder that even the most turbulent times eventually yield to tranquility. May the quiet of Alexandria's harbor tonight be the gentle current that carries you into a deep and restorative sleep. Rest well.